All right, boys and girls, thank you for joining me today for the greatest chess lesson of all time. I am your instructor, Coach Daniel Brennan, also affectionately known as Grandmaster Awesome. I cut my own hair yesterday, and I am ready to rock and roll. Let me start out by saying that I miss you all. I hope you're doing well, and I'm very happy to see some familiar faces tuning in. Hello, chess minions. The title of my lesson today is Bishops, the Good, the Bad, and the Active. By the end of our time together, I want you to know how to identify good, bad, and active bishops. I want you to understand what these bishop terms mean, and I want you to start applying these concepts in your own chess games. More specifically, I want you to learn how to make your bishops happy. And doesn't every little bishop deserve to be happy? Let's define good, bad, and active. The three types of bishops are used to describe a bishop's relationship with its friendly pawn chain. Let's play through the start of a game and talk about each of the four bishops on the board. There we go. This will help you understand the terms good bishop, bad bishop, and active bishop. Bad bishops are described as bishops whose central pawns are on their color. Center pawns are the pawns on the E and D files. So you begin the game with four of them, and you'll typically have four until they get exchanged off. So after only two moves in this game, and I'll remove the arrows just for clarity's sake, you can see that Black's bishop on F8 is already blocked in by the pawn on D6. Black's pawn on E5 is also on a dark square. The bishop on F8, therefore, is considered a bad bishop. He can't really do much because he's trapped behind his own pawns. Now let's look at White's bishop on C4. White's center pawns on D3 and E4 are on the same color as this bishop. They're on white squares. And technically, this makes the C4 bishop bad. But there is one big difference between White's bishop on C4 and Black's bishop on F8. Black's bishop on F8 is trapped behind Black's pawn chain. White's bishop on C4 is not trapped behind White's pawn chain. It managed to get outside of or in front of White's pawn chain. We call this an active bishop. An active bishop is just a bad bishop that made it outside of the pawn chain. The easiest bishop to define is the good bishop. A good bishop is described as having no friendly center pawns on its color. The bishop on D7 is a good bishop because it is a light squared bishop, and Black's center pawns are on dark squares. White's bishop on E3 is also a good bishop because White does not have any central pawns on dark squares. Because no friendly central pawns block them, good bishops can see a lot of squares. Just look at how many squares White's good bishop on E3 controls, and then compare that to Black's bad bishop on E7. White's bishop is a much happier piece. You want to make your bishops either good or at least active. So let's talk specifically about how we can avoid creating bad bishops. The number one tip to remember is this: be very careful whenever you move a center pawn only one square. For example, this move is good for the bishop on F1, but it will make it harder for White to bring out the bishop on C1. Now white has moved both of his center pawns one square, and this has already made both of his bishops bad. The two bishops are blocked in by white's two center pawns on e3 and d3. Black, on the other hand, was able to move both of his center pawns without blocking either one of his bishops. Black has two active bishops. Black's bishops are able to see more squares than both of white's bishops. Let's rewind and find a better second move for white. Instead of moving the pawn to d3, white has a neat idea that can prevent his bishops from being bad. Here, white found a clever way for his dark squared c1 bishop to see the middle of the board without blocking his light squared f1 bishop. White's bishops are both happy now. Here is another example. Because of white's first move, his bishop on c1 can move and enter the game. White also wants to move his pawn on e2 so that his bishop on f1 can get out. If he moves his e2 pawn right now, though, what happens? Well, the bishop on f1 can get out now, but white has blocked his happy bishop on c1 and made it into a bad bishop. Let's see how white could have avoided this problem. Before we move the pawn on e2 to e3, let's first get our bishop on c1 outside of the pawn chain. White has gotten his dark squared bishop outside of his pawn chain. Therefore, it is an active bishop. An active bishop is a happy bishop. Meanwhile, white's bishop on f1 can also move. White's center pawns are on dark squares, meaning that white's light squared bishop is a good bishop. A good bishop is also a happy bishop. White has avoided making any bad bishops. Let's make one more move for black. Black decides to move his pawn to e6. Now, what's wrong with this move? Black just made his c8 bishop bad. Some people actually call this a turtle bishop because the bishop is stuck living inside of a shell of pawns. That's not where bishops want to be. A turtle bishop is basically a giant pawn. Let's build on what we've learned so far by looking at some quick exercises. Follow along at home and see if you can figure out the answers before I give them to you. Which one of these four bishops is a bad bishop? Black's bishop on f8 is the bad bishop because it is blocked by its own d6 pawn. The other three bishops are happy. Bonus question time. Out of the three bishops circled on the board, two of them are good and the third one is active. Which of these three bishops is active? Remember that an active bishop has at least one center pawn stuck on its color, but that bishop can still get out. The answer is that white's light squared bishop is the active bishop. Even though white has a center pawn on a light square, the bishop was still able to get out and in front of the white pawn chain. Let's do the same thing with this position. This time, there are two bad bishops on the board. If you look at the center pawns, you'll be able to figure out very quickly which two bishops are bad. White's bishop on c1 is a bad bishop because white's center pawns are on dark squares. So is this f4 pawn. So you can see that everything is on dark squares here. This makes it very hard for white to get his bishop outside of the pawn chain. Black's bishop on d7 is also a bad bishop for exactly the same reasons. Black's pawns are on light squares. At this time, future chess masters, I'll invite you to click the raise hand button if you would like to ask me a question about good, bad, or active bishops.
All right, if we have any questions about good, bad, or active bishops, you can click the raise hand button, and I'll call on you roughly in the order in which you do that, or you can type me questions in the chat as well. First up, Akshaj, what is your question?
Can you show me an example of an active bishop on c1?
Sure, we can probably flip through and find an active c1 bishop. Let's see. So this bishop is active. We'll even go back a couple of moves so it's a little bit more clear. So here, the c1 bishop is active because even though white has got this pawn on d4, right? You see that this is a pawn on a dark square, and this is a dark squared bishop, but the bishop is not blocked in. If white makes the move e3, then the bishop on c1 becomes a bad bishop. But here, white is going to make a smart move and play bishop to f4 before he plays e3, and this makes the bishop active because it's not blocked in by the pawns in the same color.
All right. Sorry, 1 second. Get back to where I was here. All right, next up, Ronan. Ronan, what's your question?
There were some examples that you showed. Well, you know how you did the exercises?
Yes, sir.
Some of the bad bishops had a move to get out. They were not exercises, but you just did some examples where there were bishops that were bad, but they had a move to get out. But that would make them kind of a good bishop if they moved that move.
That's a good point.
So I was just confused why you said they were bad bishops.
Well, so again, a bad bishop is a bishop that can't get out because it has pawns on the same color as it. These center pawns, the E pawn and the D pawn, are on the same color squares as the bishop. If a bishop is technically bad by that definition, but can still find good squares on the board, so here in the position we're looking at, this bishop on c4, which is circled in green, is technically a bad bishop because white has a pawn on a light square which gets in this bishop's way. But to your point, we can move this bishop outside of white's pawn chain and find reasonable squares for it so that he can contribute and attack black's position. So this would be considered an active bishop. So the term active simply means that a bishop is bad, but it has good squares to go to. It's not stuck like a turtle bishop.
And I would add, stay tuned, because I think we're going to be talking a little bit about when we can improve our bad bishop or make it not bad anymore.
Oh, we are indeed.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that as well. So good. I like where you were going with that, Ronan. Excellent question.
Okay, so one of the questions that I fielded was about what to do when you have a bishop and it's not a good bishop. And I'd like to resume by taking another look at the position that we just finished with. The circled bishops on c1 and d7 are both bad. When you have a bad bishop, though, it does not have to stay bad. There is always hope. You can, and you should, try to make bad bishops better. You can accomplish this by either moving your center pawns onto the opposite color or by getting your bad bishop outside of your pawn chain. For example, white can try to fix his bad c1 bishop by creating a new home for it on A3. Now, the C1 bishop is active because it has gotten outside of the pawn chain. White did a great job improving his bad bishop. Let's look at how black might similarly try to fix his own bad bishop on D7. So white's going to play rook B1 here. And after A6, bishop to E3, black comes up with a creative idea, knight to A7. Black moves his knight out of the way so that the bad bishop on D7 can move to the B5 square and get outside of black's pawn chain. He's done it. Black's bishop is not stuck behind pawns anymore. It is now active and therefore happy. In our next position, white's bishop on F1 is bad because it is blocked by his center pawn on D3. How do we fix that? We can get the pawn out of the way by playing D4. Notice that our knight on D2 protects our pawn on E4 so that black's knight on F6 cannot capture it for free. And our C3 pawn also protects our D4 pawn so that black cannot capture it for free using his E5 pawn. Because of the move we just made, our F1 bishop is not bad anymore. This is an unhappy bishop, happy bishop, unhappy, and happy. Last exercise. White's bishop on C1 is unhappy right now. How can we get him out so that he's not blocked in by our pawns? White sees that he has 4 pawns blocking his bishop to the right side, so he decides to put his bishop on the left side. Now, the bishop is not blocked by any pawns, and he can see lots of squares, including 2 important middle squares. And on top of that, he's even making a simple attack against black's rook. This is an active, happy bishop. Like almost every rule in chess, the rules about bishops have exceptions. In this position, white's center pawns are on light squares, D3 and E4. And since white's bishop on G3 is a dark squared bishop, that means it's a good bishop, right? Well, according to the definitions we've learned, yes. In this case, though, it's not really a happy bishop because it's hopelessly blocked by black's pawns. Black's pawns will not allow the bishop on G3 to do anything useful. The bishop can't move anywhere safely, it can't meaningfully threaten anything, and it can't see very many squares. I think this last point is extremely important. The more squares a bishop can see, the happier it is. This is generally true for all pieces in chess. Black's good bishop on E6, for example, can see 11 squares. Black's bad bishop on D6 can only see 4 squares. It's like being in a movie theater and somebody stands right in front of your view and you can't see the screen. It's annoying, right? This poor bishop on D6 can look in 4 different directions, but he can't see anything. Now, white's bishop on G3 is supposed to be good, but it can only see 5 squares. That's not very impressive. I want you to understand that our definitions, good, bad, and active, they're only guidelines. To truly know if a bishop is happy or sad, you have to put yourself in his shoes and count how many squares he controls. More squares is almost always better. We all like to have control, right?
Indeed.
Now, chess minions, allow me to take you back in time to an actual tournament game that I played with the white pieces just last year. I lost this game. Believe it or not, I lose a lot of games. And that's okay. We play chess to have fun, and when we do lose, it provides a great opportunity to learn from our mistakes and improve for next time. So let's learn from my mistakes together. I pushed my pawn to g4 here because otherwise black was going to capture my pawn on g3 and make my king a lot less safe. My bishop on g2, circled in red, is very bad. I thought I could allow my bishop to stay bad because black also has a very bad bishop on e7. It too is circled in red. I have a bad bishop. My opponent has a bad bishop. That seems okay, right? Well, maybe it would have been okay, except that my opponent managed to make his bad bishop active, and well, I couldn't fix mine. Almost all of my pieces are on the queen side, so that's where I wanted to make moves. Black captures en passant for those of you who know about that super special chess move. If you don't know about en passant, don't worry, you'll learn about it at a later date. It's really not important to know here. So black is playing on the king side where his pieces are, and he's now threatening to win a pawn. He has two attackers on g4, which is a group attack, and I only have one defender, my little pawn on h3. I didn't want to make my king less safe by playing g takes h5, so instead I decided to play f3 to add another defender. Now, I will say, look at my bishop on g2. This poor bishop has got to be one of the worst bishops in the history of chess. And unfortunately for me, my opponent found a wonderful idea for himself. He intends to fix his own bad bishop by moving it in front of his pawn chain. That's why he made this move, bishop to g4. He has ideas about eventually coming into f2 and then backing up so that his bishop is in front of his pawns. I moved my king to just try to make him a little bit safer from attack. Black moves his bishop forward very cleverly, and the idea is to open this h4 square for the black queen, because if the queen can get to h4, she can assist the bishop in rerouting to f2 and then to either e3 or d4. It's worth mentioning that white's king is the only reason that black currently cannot play bishop to f2 and then bishop to e3 or d4, making the bishop active. As mentioned, here comes the black queen to support the bishop, and now black is threatening to play bishop to f2, followed by bishop to d4 or bishop to e3. I can prevent this idea with rook to f1, and now this war over the f2 square is a good example of a square attack. To learn about the 5 types of attacks in chess, feel free to watch my video from last week, which covers that topic in detail. King to d1 is a terrible move, which gives black control over the f2 square. Now, black can use this f2 square to improve his bishop. Black's creative maneuver is finished, and his bad bishop is not bad anymore. Meanwhile, my own bishop on g2 is as bad as it ever was. I'm basically playing a whole piece down now, since my poor bishop isn't any better than a pawn. I didn't have a way to fix it, and I actually lost very quickly from this point. Note that playing something like knight takes d4 is not a good option for white. It gives black a passed pawn, which also threatens my knight on c3. You'll learn all about passed pawns later this month when Coach Ryan covers the topic of pawn promotion and Coach Miami talks about how frustrating it is to stop passed pawns from promoting. And of course, my bishop on g2 is still a terrible, worthless piece. I'd like to finish up by teaching you all a fun chess term called a fianchetto. Fianchetto is an Italian word that basically means, quote, to the side, end quote. Any bishop can only be developed in two directions, along only two possible diagonals. For example, White's bishop on f1 must choose between the f1 a6 diagonal or the f1 h3 diagonal. White can move his e-pawn and bring the bishop out along the f1 a6 diagonal, or White can move the g-pawn and bring the bishop out to the side. In this case, the f1 bishop can go to either g2 or h3. On h3, the bishop would not control any middle squares. You can see this indicated by the red arrow. On g2, however, the bishop controls not only one, but two middle squares. g2 is a much better choice. Remember that in the opening, controlling the center is one of your main goals. Coach Ryan's very first video was all about attacking the center. This two-move method of developing your bishop to the side is so common that it has a name, a fianchetto. Now you can speak some Italian. Fianchetto! Now, White has fianchettoed both of his bishops. Together, they cut across the middle of the board and control all four of the center squares. Give it a try sometime. Fianchetto!
We will end here for the day. We will be meeting again tomorrow at 4 p.m. Stay tuned. We should have that invite going out to most of you this evening, and if you don't receive it this evening, you will receive it tomorrow. And if you are not attending tomorrow's lesson, reminder that we are playing chess on leechess.org on Friday at 4 o'clock. So please join us tomorrow at 4 or on Friday at 4 o'clock to either listen to another chess lesson or play some chess.
Cool. Fianchetto!
Goodbye.
Bye, guys.